Today on the Servant Leadership Podcast, we hear from David Phillips, founder and president of Children's Hunger Fund. For over 30 years, Children's Hunger Fund has delivered food and the hope of the gospel to children in need, serving thousands of churches and distributing hundreds of millions of meals around the world. In this conversation, you'll hear how Children's Hunger Fund grew from a garage-based startup in Los Angeles to a global ministry meeting physical and spiritual needs in some of the world's most vulnerable places. If you want to see what faithful, lifelong servant leadership really looks like, this one's for you. Dave, thank you for being on the Servant Leadership Podcast.
Chris, I'm glad I'm here. This is going to be fun.
I'm so excited. We've known each other for a long time, and I'm excited for our audience to get to know you. The story of what you've done here, we're sitting at Children's Hunger Fund in California. The story is just unbelievable. Tell us a little bit of the background of how this all came to be and what you do.
Sure. First of all, my role, I'm president and founder of Children's Hunger Fund. We're in our 34th year, based in Los Angeles, but we're truly global in our scope of distribution. And our primary goal is to resource gospel-centered churches across America and around the world with food packs that are mandated to be hand-delivered to the homes of children that live in poverty for the purpose of building a trust relationship and sharing Christ and drawing them into the church. And so a little bit of my background, I never thought that God would lead me into ministry. I was actually kind of the opposite. I was really blessed. I grew up in Southern California in a Christian home that was very missions-minded. Had parents that were actually their first year of marriage, they were the first two staff members for World Vision in Korea and intended to be full-time missionaries, but things in their life changed. And my dad ran a missionary support organization for 40 years. So I grew up in a home filled with missionaries all the time, kind of felt like a missionary kid myself, and wasn't sure I wanted that life for me and my family. Had a great life, but was maybe a little bit more materialistic coming out of high school. And so not knowing any better, I figured, man, I'm going to go to college and pursue international banking. Why international banking? That's where all the money is. And I just figured, man, I wanted to be that guy that wrote the big checks for the kingdom, not necessarily do the work of the kingdom. And that all changed really my last semester of college. I had planned to go to Europe on a Europe semester on international banking, and that door closed. And very rapidly, God opened a door for me to get involved in starting a local feeding program in South Central Los Angeles. And South Central Los Angeles is known for the gangs and the riots and a lot of poverty, and really had a chance to launch a feeding program that was targeting families that lived in the low-income projects, and had a chance to bring in the church and to see a bridge built between the church and children in poverty, and really felt like, man, food can be a powerful tool to share the gospel if it's used in the right way. Mm-hmm. So that's in my background, but also during my stay there, about 3 years out of college, I had a chance to go overseas. I went to Honduras and Guatemala, and I was tasked to go visit a program in Honduras that needed resourcing. And so what I saw in Honduras, I went to the capital city, and in Honduras, there's one pediatric hospital that serves the whole country. And so if any kid in Honduras needs chemo or radiation, they're brought to the capital city and they're treated there. So at the time that I visited, there was a missionary couple that was taking children that had been deemed terminal by the hospital, and they were brought into this little modest home. And this couple just kind of loved on them for the last few days they had left to live. And so I was tasked to go see them, see what their needs were, and how they could be helped. And quite honestly, God just wrecked me on that trip. The day I visited, there were about 60 children there that all had been treated with chemo. So they were thin, frail, lost their hair, all under 6 years old. And this couple didn't have enough resources to feed them all, didn't even have basic painkillers to make them comfortable. And their sole focus was love these kids, share Christ with them before they pass. And So I came back to Los Angeles after visiting them, convinced I was going to move down to Honduras and I was going to be an advocate for this facility. I was in my mid-20s. I was single. I didn't have any real ties, and met with my pastor and a lot of Christian men that I respected. And they're all kind of like, man, maybe stay in the States and see what God does with this vision. And maybe you're being reactive or emotional, but people that know me, I'm an emotional flatliner, you know. But I was just convinced that more could be done to care for children in this type of situation. So I stayed. I continued to develop that feeding program in South Central Los Angeles, and 3 years go by. I get married about halfway through that time frame, and we're in our first or second year of marriage, and I came home. I remember it was Friday before 4th of July weekend. And I told my wife, Lynn, I go, I'm going to quit my job. I got to do something different. And she goes, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. Never a good answer, by the way. We were, young marrieds, just about to buy our first home, start a family, do all the things that young couples do. And I said, I need to do something different. And Lynn said, well, what's driving that? And I said, I can't get these image of these kids in Honduras out of my head. And I feel like God has something more for us. And one of the things that I had learned in the years prior to that is that there was a lot of corporate wealth in America, particularly in the food industry. There's a lot of surplus. And I wanted to use my business background to access the wealth of corporate America and some of the surplus and channel that to churches and ministries that are on the ground that are doing things to care for children like these kids in Honduras. And so we went away that weekend, and we literally came back from the weekend with the name and the mission statement for Children's Hunger Fund. And Lynn was great. She said, we'll put our family plans on hold. She was a school teacher, and she said, man, I'll keep teaching, and if I'll support you in this, if God's in it. We'll give it a few years and see what God does. And so that's how we started out. And what I love about God is that when you take a step of faith, God just doesn't chop you off at the knees, right? He comes alongside you and often undergirds you in that step of faith. And that's what he did for us. And the best way to explain that, we had just gone through the incorporation process. So this is 3-4 months later. And I get a call from that missionary down in Honduras, and he calls me up and he says, hey, Dave, we just got these 7 kids in at the hospital. And if we don't get this one particular cancer drug, these children don't have a chance to live. And I said, well, I don't know anything about cancer drugs, but, give me the name and I'll try to find it. And I remember the name was like 20 letters long, a word I couldn't even pronounce. And I remember writing it down on a little scratch paper, and we talked a little bit more. We prayed together, and I said, hey, I'll try to find the drug. So I hang up the phone, and this was back in 1991. So you had to hang up the phone back then. And so I hung up the phone, and the receiver is still in my hand, and the phone rings again. And I pick it up, and it's this guy back east that says, hey, I have this really unusual donation. I don't know if you can use it, but it's a cancer drug for kids. And I'm like, what's the name of the drug? And it matched identically what was on this piece of paper. And I was just floored. I was completely overwhelmed. And this guy went on to say, Dave, this is a huge donation. We have 48,000 vials of this drug. Street value, it's worth about $8 million. And we'll airlift it anywhere around the world if you can get it into children's hospitals or clinics that can use it. And so I took the next 48 hours, and I found about 20 different medical clinics that could use this drug. And God just placed that in 20 different countries. And after that phone call, there's no way to put into words what that call did for me and Lynn in our faith journey. It just floored us that God would do that. And there were so many lessons that he taught us, but I think the biggest lesson that he taught me in that very moment was that God had a much bigger vision for Children's Hunger Fund than I did. And that if I would just stay out of his way and let him lead, that he had a global vision for CHF. Because when we started, I just envisioned, being from Southern California, that we would resource some churches locally, and get them involved in food programs for the purpose of building relationships, and maybe help a handful of projects every year, like these kids in Honduras. And Chris, it's staggering, as you know. This year, we just finished out our year, and we received $165 million in corporate gifts. Most of that is food. We're able to put that into our food packs and convert that to over 70 million meals that goes out to thousands of churches across the United States and another 1,000 churches in 33 developing countries. And that wasn't the initial vision, but that's what God has done over 34 years. And in many ways, it's just been like strap on the seatbelt and watch what God has done. And what I love about God is he's been so faithful. I think if you could say, what's the name of Children's Hunger Fund, it's really been God's story. It hasn't been our story. And it's been a story of his faithfulness and his provision. It's almost always in the 11th hour. There's been so many times over 34 years where we've never known where payroll is going to come from in 2 weeks, but we've never missed a payroll period. We've just seen God bless and open doors and do things that only God can accomplish. And so that's been our journey in a nutshell. And it's been just a joy to be a part of it.
It is such a crazy journey because it goes from not even thinking about getting into this full time to then doing something small in your garage to then going full time and now doing over 70 million meals in a year. Is just crazy.
That's a good point. I didn't mention that we started in our garage. And there's another story I'd love to tell real quickly. A lot of people won't remember this, but if you go back to January of 1994, there was a big earthquake in Los Angeles County. It was called the Northridge earthquake. And we had shifted from working out of our garage to a little small rented facility in the center of the San Fernando Valley. It wasn't much larger than a 3-car garage, but we were doing our distributions there, and we were serving about 8 churches a week that were feeding about 300 families with food. And that was our program. And we did distributions on Friday, 1 day a week. And then this earthquake hits, right? And I remember when the earthquake hit, just to tell you what a small mom and pop we were, we had less than $400 in our business checking account. So we're living week to week, still living mostly on Lynn's salary. And I've got one employee that helps on the warehouse on Fridays. That's the extent of our payroll. And we're just kind of limping along. This earthquake hits and FEMA calls me, the director for the state for California FEMA program. And says, hey, the federal government wants to bring in 100 truckloads of food, and we want to do it through Children's Hunger Fund. And I said, why? And he said, well, Children's Hunger Fund has the largest surviving charitable warehouse in the San Fernando Valley. I mean, this is an area of 10 million people, and there were really no charities. Even to this day, there's no food bank in the valley. It's all the resources are going to South Central and downtown Los Angeles. And so the director said, hey, we want to give you all this food. And I'm like, okay. I said, I'm agreeable to it on one condition. And he said, what's that condition? I said, well, we want to give the food out in the name of the Lord. And I go, what I mean by that is we won't discriminate. We'll get it all out to the earthquake victims and to families, but I want to give it out through churches. And I said, are you good with that? And he told me off the record, he goes, Dave, I really don't care what you do with the food. I got so much pressure from Washington to get these truckloads in here. And if you can get them out, we'll help you get them out. And so FEMA was great. They actually gave us access to a second warehouse. They gave us walkie-talkies. Back then, there were no cell phones, so we could communicate to each other. And they gave us access to a forklift. And it was crazy. Overnight, we went from serving 8 churches and 300 families to 2 weeks later, we had 110 churches. Most of those churches were coming in 6 days a week to get food. And we had to collect signatures from the families that got the food. And our biggest week was the second week, where we served 48,000 families. So 300 to 48,000 families in 2 weeks. So this went on. We kept getting food from the government for about 6 months. And then we were a week or two into it, and then all of a sudden we have truckloads just showing up at our door, and the private sector was hearing about us. And we'd get this truckload of canned food, and we'd ask the driver, where's it from? He goes, I don't know. I was just told to bring it here. And just every day, truckloads are coming in. So one of the things that FEMA told us is that, hey, just keep all of your receipts related to the earthquake expenses, and we'll reimburse you. So I didn't know anything back then. So I said, sure. And so we're collecting all these receipts, and we're 3 months into this. And while we're getting all these food donations, we don't have any money, right? We had $400 when we started. And so 3 months in, I've got about $33,000 of unpaid freight bills. So we've got trucking companies now billing us for the food, and I've got no resources. So I go down to talk to FEMA downtown Los Angeles. I meet in their office. I bring my books. I said, hey, I've got all these bills to pay. And they're like, yeah, these are all legit, but the money hasn't come down from Washington yet. Hang in there and you'll get paid. So I believe them. So I said, great, I'll hang in there. So 3 more months go by. Now we're 6 months in. The debt is now $63,000, and that might as well have been $6 million because our donor base was basically my family and a couple friends, and so we're 6 months in, and now creditors are starting to call, and I'm kind of feeling like this is really not just being damaging to Children's Hunger Fund, but we're damaging our witness, and we just need to shut it down. So that weekend I went home, and I told my wife that I'm going to go down to FEMA one more time. And if I don't get, I'm going to wait there and get it until I get paid. So I went down 8:30 in the morning, had an appointment with FEMA. Same story. Money hasn't come in. We can't help you. I sat there till 6 p.m. until they locked me out of their office and sent me home. Came home and told Lynn, I said, I think we're done. And so I go, we're going to just shut it all down. And we weren't sad. I mean, it was amazing. If CHF existed just for the earthquake, during that 6-month period, 110 churches got engaged with feeding and meeting the needs of their community. Over 8,000 individuals came to Christ, and churches were growing. Great things were happening. It felt almost like what happened at 9/11, where people started going back to church, and going back to God and having faith in God again. That was the same thing that happened in the Valley at that time. So we're shutting it down. So Monday morning comes along. I'm going to go tell my one worker we're going to close shop and go home. And I don't know why, that Monday morning I stopped by our P.O. box and just to pick up mail for the week. And that particular day I go open the P.O. box, and there's 3 envelopes that are in my mailbox. So I sit in my car in the parking lot, and I figure I'm going to open them. And I sit there, and the first 2 envelopes had unsolicited grants from 2 large corporations, household names, you would know them. And the third was a check. And those 3 checks totaled $63,000. I mean, to the penny. And I sat in my car and I just cried. And I just said, God, you are so good. You are so faithful. I don't understand how you work or the ways that you work, but you're just faithful. And so we kept going. And I share that story because 85 of those churches stayed with us after the crisis was over. We just encouraged all this incredible growth, and we were able to do it in a way to serve God's church in a large way that had lasting impact. And that story is another one of many that has just driven the mission and the vision of CHF, recognizing that in many ways, I kind of feel like we sit in God's sweet spot. Because if you read Scripture, it's so clear that God has a special place in his heart for his church, and we serve his church. And you can't read Scripture without understanding how much God talks about being the father of the fatherless and the care for children that are abused, neglected, abandoned, you name it. He even says, Christ himself said, let the little children come to me. And that's who we serve. That's our target audience. And so I feel like, we have experienced God's favor, but also with that, we have an incredible responsibility to steward what God gives us well. And that stewardship element is another thing that makes us unique, as far as we've traditionally been one of America's most cost-effective charities. Our overhead this year is less than 2%. And that's not by accident. That's really by design. We really view every dollar that we receive as given like the widow's mite, and we have a responsibility. Whether it's a child that does a chore to raise a quarter to provide a meal for a child through our food pack program, or somebody gives us $1,000, it doesn't matter. The same stewarding element applies to that gift, that we want to stretch it and use it for maximum impact to fulfill the vision of CHF.
I love it. Obviously, there's been tons of leading through crisis, tons of where you've stepped into natural disasters and wars and other areas and just provided tons of relief. On the other side, there's this amazing vision that God keeps putting on your heart and the organization's heart. Something that people might not realize unless they're local is about what you've done with the poverty encounter experience. It's interesting because if people look you up, they'll immediately see all the food pack stuff. They'll see the amount of aid you're providing. Where did the idea of helping people catch the vision come from?
That really came from personal experience. And as you know, we have 4 boys. They're all full grown now. But my wife and I decided when our oldest son turned 9 years old that I was doing a lot of international travel back then. Back then, it was my job to really do the advance work, to go into a new country and establish the relationships and the church network that we were going to work through. So I was doing this a lot, and we thought, man, it'd be great if I could take one of my boys with me each time. And we had a purpose in that, and it was really twofold. We wanted to expose them to global poverty. We wanted to see how 95% of the world lives. They don't live like most people in the United States. And we wanted them to see that God is a universal God, that God is not just alive and well in our church or in our family or in our neighborhood, but he's global. And so the very first trip, I took our oldest son, Justin, down to El Salvador. I figure it's a safe trip, and it's easy on the jet lag. It's only a couple hour time change, 8-hour flight. And we were going down there to look at 5 different churches that wanted us to bring food packs. And these were all in very, very poor areas. 3 of them were in trash dumps. One was a cemetery that was on a hillside where squatters had come in and moved in, built little shanty homes over the tombstones to live in this community. So I was thinking, man, this is really safe. I'll just take Justin and we'll get some entry-level exposure. And the first home we visited, we're in a trash dump, and there's a single mom that has about 5 kids, and she's holding a newborn baby boy. And in the conversation, she shares that 3 weeks prior to our visit, she had given birth to twin boys. And Justin understood that and innocently asked the lady, the mom, said, where's your other baby? And the mom started to cry. And the mom just looked at us and said, just before you arrived, I had to sell my baby in order to get food to feed my other 5 kids. And I remember in that moment, Justin looked up at me and said, Dad, did I hear her correctly? And I said, yes, son, that's what she said. And Justin looked at me and said, Dad, how does a mom's situation become so desperate? Well, she'll sell her own son for a bag of beans, because that is what she had done. Mm. And at that point, as a dad, I didn't have an answer. I said, Justin, I don't know what to tell you. We can't change this woman's situation, but if God lets CHF come and serve churches here, maybe we can change the future for other families, that they won't have to sell their kids because the church can help them. And Justin came back from that experience different. The second home we went to, just real quickly, a very similar home, a young mom with 4 kids, and one of her kids was about a 6 or 7-year-old daughter, and she was immediately taken to Justin. So she grabs Justin by the hand, and she's all excited to show him her little home, a little 10 by 10 shack, and said, over in this corner, this is where my mom sleeps. My brother sleeps over here. And she walks outside, and outside is this trash dump, and there's this little river of sludge that runs behind the house, and there's some reeds that are growing in this sludge. And she said, my mom took some of those reeds and knitted this little, wove this little mat, and this is where I sleep outside on this mat. And she was all proud to show us her bed. And so Justin's taking all this in, and then she sees a chicken run by, and she runs over and she grabs an egg. And she says, Justin, do you know what this is? And he goes, yeah, it's an egg. And she goes, no, you know what this means? This means me and my 3 siblings, we get to eat today. Well, Justin had 3 little brothers at home, right? And in his mind, his 10-year-old, 9-year-old mind, he can't compute. How does 1 egg feed 4 kids, knowing that he goes through a dozen eggs, at home for him and his brothers? And he just came back from those trips different. And so I began to realize as the years went on that there's 2 types of children we want to impact. The obvious child, which is that suffering child that lives in poverty. But what about kids like our own? Kids that live here in the United States that may never, ever leave their own city or state, let alone go to a foreign country to see what really extreme poverty looks like. And so I recognize that that's going to be a hard audience to reach. And so I said, what if we could bring those experiences and those environments to our headquarters and set up kind of a field trip experience for schools and churches and youth groups to come and get exposed to global poverty, but from a biblical perspective. How does God want us to respond to the poor? So this goes back more than a decade ago. I had a chance to meet with the Imagineers at Walt Disney Studios. I had a friend that worked at Disney, and I shared kind of my vision, and he goes, oh, you should talk to the Imagineers. And so over 6 months, I got a chance to meet with the Imagineers 3 times and shared kind of the brainstorm idea, the big picture idea, and they kind of broke up into corners of their creative room and just started ideating, and they came back with all these crazy ideas. And I remember one of their ideas was the lobby for the tour could start as like a plain theater, and you show a video introducing 4 children that live in these different environments. And the last one lives in a disaster area where there's a large earthquake. And she says, this is what my life was like. And then this earthquake hits, and it was really challenging. And at that point, we can make the lights go off, make the room shake, and then the lights come back on. It looks like the ceiling's about to fall on you, and the side wall opens up, and you walk into like Haiti after the earthquake. And I told these Imagineers, I go, guys, we live in Southern California where earthquakes are very real. I go, the first tour, I'm going to have kids that won't sleep at night, parents that want to sue us. It's just never going to work. So those are the types of ideas that they had. But by meeting with them, it convinced me that if God was in this, we could do this. So 5 years ago, we opened a 75-minute tour here where you basically walk in, and it's a recreation of an airport terminal in the lobby, and you're told you're going to take a flight and you're going to meet some kids in parts of the world you've probably never seen before. So we built the fuselage of an airplane into our warehouse. You take a little simulated flight, and then we take you through immersive sets. And in every set, you meet a child that lives in poverty. You learn about the themes that God is a personal God, loves the poor, so should we. And the way he wants us to respond is through a heart of compassion and service. And then at the end of the tour, there's a call to action. We don't want the kids to leave feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of poverty, because global poverty is overwhelming, but we wanted them to feel empowered. And so we asked them to stay for 30 minutes. They go into our volunteer center, and they either assemble food packs or meal packs that go into our food pack. And we tell those 15 guests that just took that tour, hey, in 30 minutes, you just assembled 500 meals for children you're never going to meet, but you just made a difference. And those kids then go back to their campuses, and we challenge them to do something, to be an advocate for the poor. I don't care if you do it with Children's Hunger Fund, do it with your church, do it with your school. But we've had kids that have just done amazing things. This might blow you away, but we tell kids when they leave that 25 cents provides a meal for a child through our food packs. And so we give them little coin banks. So if they want to go home and do chores, they can collect quarters. And then when they come back the next time to volunteer, they can turn their quarters in. And we've been doing this for about 12 years. And we've had kids in over 4,000 churches across America. And those that have come through our facilities, they've collected almost 20 million quarters to feed kids. So they get it. Yeah. When they come through the exhibit, they get it, and they want to be part of the solution. Wow. Long story, but it's amazing how God's used it.
It is absolutely amazing. I mean, part of the fun thing from your role is you get to work with thousands of churches. You get to have thousands of stories of people impacted and people who you're helping with food and the gospel, and then also impacted by being able to help other people.
Yeah, absolutely.
We talk a ton about servant leadership on this podcast. When you hear the word servant leadership, what do you think of, and how does it relate to you and all the leaders that you're working with around the world?
You can't talk about servant leadership without the example of Jesus Christ. That is immediately where I go. I think Christ set the bar for what servant leadership looks like. I think in terms of how that plays out in my life and how I've seen it played out in the life of Children's Hunger Fund is that we have some core values that run our organization. And I would say servant leadership is a really big one, where we talk about servanthood all the time and what that looks like. And we challenge our top leaders, director and above, that you've got to lead by example. Don't ask your people to do things that you wouldn't do, as one example. But I think even maybe even equal to that or more important is the value and the importance of humility. And I can't stress enough how much humble leadership impacts the people that you lead. And we have a culture here that, and I've seen it played out time and time again with employees that haven't survived here. We kind of challenge them, leave your ego at home. You know, if we've had people come here that have been empire builders, we've had people in supervisor roles that have tried to build loyalty to themselves versus loyalty to the mission or loyalty to the vision. And those are all indicators of a lack of humility and a lack of servanthood. And so I can't stress enough how important servant leadership is. I remember when we started Children's Hunger Fund, I got some really good advice from another leader. Said, Dave, you should try to find 2 or 3 guys that are in your industry that are 25, 30 years ahead of you, and ask them if they would meet with you or if they would share what they've learned on their leadership journey. And I go, that's some really great advice. And me being young and naive, I didn't know who to ask, so I just shot big. And you'll laugh at this, but I wrote a letter to Billy Graham. And then I wrote a second letter to Bill Bright, who founded Campus Crusade for Christ. And both of those men contacted me. I was blown away. Billy Graham called me, and Bill Bright took the time to handwrite about a 12-page letter to me. And both of them, in terms of what they shared, again, you know, Billy Graham was known for, you know, his commitment to personal purity, and he had a standard. You know, he would never be alone with a woman. He wouldn't ride in a car with, you know, and he just talked about that importance of personal purity and protecting and guarding your family and your marriage and making those things first and foremost. And Bill Bright said the same thing. But I think some of the takeaways that I got from both of them was the commitment to servant leadership, to never get caught up in the flattery that can come with growth. And I remember when we started Poverty Encounter, one of the things that I told our Poverty Encounter facilitators, that most of them are college students that come in, and it's a guided tour, and they take these guests through the tour. I said, people are going to come in and probably praise you for what's being accomplished here, that it's, you know, it's a compelling exhibit. And we've tried to always train our staff. It's okay to be complimented, but rather than receiving the compliment, redirect it to the Lord and say, yes, isn't it amazing what God is doing? And doesn't he deserve all the glory? And Billy Graham and Bill Bright taught me that right out of the box, that the day that you start to believe the good things that people say about you is the beginning of your downfall. And the day that you start to believe all the bad things that people will want to say about you, the critics, that you've got to develop thick skin as a leader. They talked about how leadership isolates, and boy, I've lived through that. You know, when you're the top guy, you know, I have a policy where I love eating in the lunchroom, and you know, a lot of CEOs maybe don't do that, but I love eating in the lunchroom with our staff, and it always freaks out new staff members. If I sit down next to them, they want to move over 4 seats, or, oh boy, what is this guy going to say to me? But I found that part of servant leadership is making yourself real and making yourself accessible to those that you lead. And I want everybody on our staff to feel like I've got an open door. I'm no different than you. I tie my shoes the same way you tie your shoes. And if I can pass anything of worth on to you and what leadership has taught me or what the Lord has taught me, I want to share that. And I think another lesson that Bill Bright taught me was don't be afraid to hire people that are smarter than you and more skilled and more gifted than you. And I think for a lot of young leaders, that's hard to do. And that was definitely something that I had to grow in recognizing that as CHF was growing, it finally got to the point where I couldn't keep my arms around it. And that was probably the best day in our history, when I recognized this has never been about me, and here I'm thinking I've got to hold it all in. But the day I shifted from this to my hands out and saying, God, this is all yours. I need to trust you with the leaders that you bring us, the board members that you bring us, the senior staff, the expertise. And it's so amazing to sit here 34 years later and to think that so much of what happens with CHF, I don't even know what all that we do because I don't try to hold it all. And, we've got so many gifted people here, and hopefully we give them the runway to really grow and mature and to use their creativity and their gifting. And that's a really good place to be as long as they know their lane and they know the vision and they know their priorities. Let them run. And we've kind of lived that out here, and we're starting to see the blessing of that.
With that kind of freedom and empowerment, people from the outside will look at CHF and think this was easy. They'll think it's just been successful since day one. And of course, because of how big they've grown, it's just been what an easy ride. But because of that empowerment you give people, because of the vision casting, because you really let people own stuff, there's been a lot of hard times and things that haven't worked. There's been things that you've tried again, and they haven't worked. And then there's been a ton of stuff where it's just opened up other doors for future opportunities. So I know, for example, you used to be in Chicago and now you're relooking at Chicago. You're doing a ton in Dallas. How do some of these missteps lead to other opportunities that then are just amazing stories in and of themselves?
Yeah. The first thing I want to comment on is your statement about how sometimes it can look easy. I don't know that a month goes by where I don't have a high school student or an early college student that's either volunteering or walks into our office and says, can you take 15 minutes? Cause I want to do what you want to do. And, I'd love to just, have this global ministry and I'm like, no, you don't, and, they don't even know what questions to ask. And, my response to that is always, well, just don't go out. Before you start something new, spend a few years in the nonprofit sector, in the industry that you're interested in, and just learn the ropes and sit under someone else's leadership and let God birth that vision and that calling in your life, which I hope is helpful. But you're right. We've had so many hits and misses. I would say there's a lot of lessons that we've learned. And one of them is, one of our distinctives is how well we vet partners around the world. We almost exclusively serve gospel-centered churches. And I think sometimes we can be naive that if you're working with a pastor, that means there really doesn't need to be a vetting process because that's a man of God and he can be trusted. And I can tell you after 34 years that the church is so filled with broken people, myself included, and the senior leader is not immune from the temptations of this world. So we really vet our pastors really, really well around the world, so much so that we have had so many churches in America that have sent containers, to a foreign country and said, look, I thought we had a trusted partner, but we've got this container stuck in customs, or we've got this pastor that is defrauding us of all our money. Will you help us? What do we do? So I do think we've learned some things, but some of the things that you referenced, like being in Chicago for 15 years, there was some great learning that came out of our Chicago experience. And one of them was the type of food that we were giving to recipient families. It maybe wasn't meeting the best needs of the community. And traditionally, our domestic food packs always had rice and beans and pasta and pasta sauce and some other things, but mainly staple items that had to be cooked. And many of the churches that we were serving in the Chicagoland area were African American. And I remember going into apartment complexes and seeing a bag of our beans being held as a doorstop on a screen door, to keep the screen door open in the apartment. And I remember seeing that repeatedly and going into the homes of the families that were being served. And the reality is that many cultures in the U.S., the poor, they no longer cook. It's a fast food, convenience store kind of mindset. Now, that's not good eating, but many people in poverty, they're also binge eaters based on the time of month when they get a paycheck. And so there was some education and some relearning that was involved. And so when we exited Chicago, one of the things that we said when we come back to Chicago, we're going to come back with a different model. And one of those things that changed was a food pack that had more ready-to-eat foods that would better serve that child, recognizing that many children that live in urban areas in poverty across America, they come home from school, their mom's working 2 part-time jobs, and they're left on their own to fend for themselves for what's for dinner. And the cupboards are bare. So having some ready-to-eat food is really helpful to that child. And so that was one major change. And then I think we've always tried to improve our stewardship and to stretch our dollars more effectively. And we're just now coming back into the Chicago market, but with a different model. Before we owned a building and we had about, 8 or 10, maybe 12 staff on the ground in that facility. And after 15 years, we were serving maybe 75 churches with food packs that were impacting, several thousand families, maybe bringing in a couple $1 million a year of food and other resources. Well, that was costing us about $1.5 million a year. And we're coming back to Chicago now with a model of coming alongside like-minded ministry partners that have a shared vision. They're on the ground. They do have access to some churches that want to be trained and resourced, but they also have a distribution facility, maybe some small warehouse space, where they're willing to serve as our distribution arm. If we come in and train and resource the churches, they'll help us with the distribution end. Well, we can do that model. Now we can probably go into Chicago and set up shop in 3 or 4 different locations around the city, and service well over 100 churches and probably bring in double the amount of food and resources at maybe a cost of $350,000 a year. It's very different, So with this new model, we can serve 5 or 6 cities for the same price of doing one that we did before. So those are just some of the lessons. And that all just comes by trial and error and being aware of what's happening on the ground and always asking the right questions about your constituents and the communities that you want to serve. What is most needed and what's most helpful?
As a leader, you step into some really big challenges and some really big opportunities. Talk a little bit about how what you're doing in Dallas now came about, and just how the opportunity presented itself and how you get even in the right headspace to tackle something like what you're doing now.
Yeah. So as far as the Dallas market, got to take you back well over a decade. We had spent 2 years and our next expansion was going to be in Atlanta. And we had spent 2 years trying to develop the Atlanta market. And what we were doing was we were going around talking to all of the large churches, trying to get some seed money and get them on board, and talking to our corporate partners. And after 2 years, the doors just weren't opening. And we were getting a lot of pats on the back. Yeah, man, when you guys open your facility, we want to come. We want to come serve. Our people want to come serve. But nobody wanted to invest, in seeding into the vision. And we were just about the end of that time frame. And Pastor Jack Graham in Dallas, who pastors Prestonwood Baptist Church, I had known him for several years. He said, next time you come through Dallas, come see me. And we had a conversation, and he said, Dave, something you said when you were here a year or two ago has really stuck with me. And I didn't remember what I said, but he said, you challenged me as a church. What are we doing to serve the suburban poor? And he goes, I didn't know what that meant. And so I've really been praying about that. I've talked to a lot of ministries that you work with. A big partner of ours is Franklin Graham and Samaritan's Purse. We resource them with a lot of toys and other things for their programs. But so Pastor Jack said, hey, what's it going to take to get you to come to Dallas? And I said, Jack, it's not even in the plan. I go, we're developing Atlanta. And I said, we're already in San Antonio. And it's not in the plan. And he said, well, what do you need, for this to be a priority? And I said, well, here's what it would cost to start up. We need more help with relationships. We need to meet some key Christian business leaders. And Jack helped us with all that. So it went from not even in the plan to 6 months later, we opened a facility in Carrollton, which is right just north of downtown Dallas. And those doors opened more than 10 years ago, and we have not been able to keep up with the growth. It's just been staggering how God has opened doors in that market. And so much so that 5 years ago, we began praying about maybe putting down some permanent roots in the Dallas market, not just to have a distribution center to process and assemble food packs, but to really grow our volunteer programs, knowing that some of the mega churches there were coming to us and saying, look, we've got 800 kids in our youth department, and we want to do a serve day on a Saturday morning. I got to find 20 charities to split my 800 kids up. And I said, well, what if we built a facility where 800 kids could come at one time and serve in our distribution center? And they're like, man, that'd be an answer to prayer. And so we started to look specifically at the Frisco Prosper market, because that's about 25 miles north of downtown Dallas. And we looked at that area specifically because Frisco now has the third largest concentration of corporate headquarters in America, behind Manhattan and the Silicon Valley. And the way we get corporations to work with us is we get their employees to come and serve, and they volunteer. Then they bring their kids, and then it creates a wellspring that gets up to the decision makers, where the question gets asked, why isn't our company doing more to help Children's Hunger Fund? And then good things happen as a result of that. So we wanted to be in that greater Frisco Prosper area, and we were able to buy some land last year in Prosper, just a complete act of God in an area that we really have no business being in. And we're in the process of building our second Poverty Encounter exhibit and a large temperature controlled volunteer center that can house 800 plus youth at a time. And we see it as an opportunity to impact the next generation with the gospel and with a heart of service and compassion. And what's been different about Dallas and Los Angeles, and everybody will understand that, is what we built in Los Angeles in terms of the Poverty Encounter. We didn't build it for the public schools. We never really thought that public schools would come, because we are a gospel-focused organization. We're not in your face with the messaging, but we are very transparent about who we are and what we believe and why we believe it. And so we've had public schools in Los Angeles come, but not en masse. Dallas has been different. We've met with so many of the superintendents of different public school districts, and they're all saying the same thing. We want all of our kids to come. We want this to be a destination point for kids to go through the tour, to come and serve, to serve their community service hours. And we haven't even built it yet, and we probably have access to 350,000 public school students. I mean, what an opportunity for the gospel. And what Dallas is recognizing, what the leaders are recognizing, is there's been such an influx of different populations, a lot from California, that they're fighting for their traditional values, and they don't want to lose those traditional values. And we want to be a part of keeping that message of biblical values in front of that population that's coming to North Dallas.
Wow. I love this. I could listen to your stories all day. I want to finish this with 60 seconds where I'm going to hit you with 10 rapid fire questions.
Oh boy.
And you just say the first thing that comes to your mind and there's no wrong answer.
Okay.
Who's the first person you think of when I say servant leadership?
Still Jesus Christ.
All right. 5 words that most describe you.
Faithful, expectant, visionary, giving. Did I say humble? You can't call yourself humble.
You can do that.
I just contradicted myself.
All right. Favorite author?
I've been called that. So
favorite author or book?
I don't have a favorite book. I grab principles from a lot of books. And if I can get a good principle out of a book, it was a good book.
Yeah.
I like a lot of leadership books, but I'm not going to name one guy.
All right. Favorite movie?
The Hobbit.
What's your favorite thing to do in your free time?
Fishing and hiking, time with my wife.
Wow. All right. Surprising fact about you. The fishing is kind of surprising, but what's another one?
Almost got arrested in Israel for throwing a stone into the cave where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Wow, that is surprising. All right, favorite place you've been?
Israel.
All right, where's somewhere you want to go that you have not been?
New Zealand.
All right, and what's the best advice you've ever received?
Don't think too highly of yourself.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dave, for sharing some of your stories, some of what God is doing at CHF, and just all the leadership lessons that hopefully people are encouraged by listening to this.
That's been fun, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Servant Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to never miss an update. Be sure to check out the servantleadershippodcast.org for more updates and additional bonus content.